Thank you everyone for coming to another week, another one of the SEConn webinars. With us from the West Coast is Jeff. He will be talking on basically all things Rebreather, from tech to rec to using it for underwater photography.
Hi all. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And what I wanted to do is we are going to be talking about rebreathers today. And most people, when they think about rebreathers, think about the fact that rebreathers are really for technical diving. That's not really the case. What I want to talk about tonight is how they help other parts of the dive population, photographers, recreational divers, and maybe even you in the audience. We'll kind of see where we go with that. So when we started with rebreathers, the people that they primarily appealed to were the people that were doing fairly extreme dives. And here's a dude on the back of a boat that's getting ready to do what you think is probably a fairly extreme. He's draped with dive gear. And he's using a rebreather for his primary gear, but even with that, he looks like he's a Christmas tree, you know, a diver's Christmas tree. But technical divers adopted the rebreather technology early on because overall, technical dives could be done in a much less expensive fashion with less equipment, although that doesn't look like less equipment, and shorter decompression. And the people that were the divers that were initial adopters on these were people that were doing extremely deep diving, people that were doing penetration wreck diving, and people that were doing penetration cave diving. And so when we looked at cave and wreck diving in particular, rebreather divers didn't have to carry as many cylinders to be able to go as far into the cave because the rebreather took place of a lot of that. Divers ended up with more bottom time and deeper penetrations and also less silting because there were no bubbles coming out of the rebreathers to disturb them. And so a single rebreather, which weighed less than a set of doubles, typically had enough air in it or enough gas to allow those divers to spend as much as 8 hours underwater, which if you were trying to do that with open circuit scuba tanks, might have required 8 or 10 or 12 cylinders, full-size cylinders, to be able to do the same thing. And so it was a much smaller package size and much less complex in terms of the overall amount and variety of gear that people were carrying. And this is a photograph of me when I was still open circuit cave diving, and that was the amount of gear it took to support me for one cave dive in the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. And deep divers were pretty much the same way. Deep divers had to carry not only lots of gas on their back for deep diving, I'm going to go one slide, whoops, we're going to, but also they had to carry multiple gases to be able to facilitate their decompression on the way up. And so again, it was not atypical to carry maybe a pair of back gas cylinders that had a high helium mix in it, and then 2 or 3 different nitrox mixes to be able to breathe on the way up, and an oxygen cylinder to be able to finish the decompression with once they got shallow. The other thing about open circuit trimix diving, where we're diving off of a helium-based gas mixture to avoid narcosis, was the fact that helium is really expensive. And so rebreathers, because it recirculated that gas, dropped the gas cost significantly. So in one project I worked on working in Lake Mead in Nevada, where we were diving a bomber, a B-29, our average gas price per diver was about $200 per dive. And utilizing a rebreather dropped that to about $15 per dive. So there was a huge cost savings in terms of just the gas that we were breathing during the dives that we were doing on that project. But the point is, in my mind, is that if it were just for technical diving, I probably would not be diving rebreathers nearly as much as I do now. The truth of the matter is I dive rebreathers. Most of my diving is what what most people would consider to be recreational diving. Most of my diving is less than 130 feet deep. Much of my diving is warm destination resorts, Caymans, Philippines, Cozumel, Fiji, places where almost anybody would like to go to be able to go diving, the Florida Keys. And I like it because rebreathers offer me a number of advantages to be able to enjoy my diving more so than I could on open circuit diving with a normal scuba tank. And so that's what I really want to talk about tonight. So the first thing I want to go over is what is a rebreather? how they can benefit you, what their downsides are, a little bit about training, and where you can go for more information. So that's kind of the areas that we're going to be going through. What a rebreather does, all rebreathers do essentially the same thing. They all capture and recirculate some or all of the breathing gas as you exhale it. So instead of losing that out to the surface, it's recirculated back through the unit so that you can breathe it over and over and over again. It also adds gas to make up for lost volume, so that as you utilize the gas, the part that you metabolize, it will automatically inject the gas that you need to be able to make up your lung volume so you can still take a deep breath. It maintains oxygen levels at a level that will still keep you alive and alert, and it removes the carbon dioxide that we exhale from the process of metabolism. So all rebreathers will do these 4 things. Now, some of the benefits of this are, with some rebreathers, you have no bubbles, or essentially no bubbles, except for when you're ascending. And so we're going to talk about how that's an advantage with photography. I've already mentioned what the advantage is for cave diving and wreck diving, but there are advantages for open circuit or for regular recreational diving as well. We get to have increased bottom time. Raise your hand if you've been on a dive and you said, oh, I really don't want to be going up now, but I have to because I've got no gas left in my cylinder. If you've been in that position, that's one of the big advantages that rebreathers can offer you. And that's because the gas economy is so great. I've done an 8-hour dive and gone through no more than 20 cubic feet of gas during that 8 hours. That's 1/4 of a standard 80 cylinder. And there's some huge benefits if you travel with flying after diving that we're going to talk about. So no bubbles. What does no bubbles buy me? I'll tell you what no bubbles buys me. This picture is what no bubbles will buy you. This picture was actually taken off of in Mexico on our way back from the Socorro Islands. I was the only person in the water. I was decompressing after a fairly deep dive, just hanging out at 50 feet off gassing. And I don't know what it was that made me stop share. I just had a survey come up that I'm not supposed to be able to vote on. I'm going to make the presumption that you guys can still see my slides because I no longer can.
We can still see them.
Okay. So I was hanging out at 50 feet, minding my own business, and I don't know what caused me to do it, but I turned around. And when I turned around, there were these 2 whales literally about 5 feet from me, just staring there, standing there, swimming there, hanging there, looking at me. And my first thought was, that's weird. Who hung that mural of 2 whales behind me while I was sitting here decompressing? And then the penny dropped and it was like, oh my God, there's 2 whales behind me. And I'm like trying to frantically grab up my camera gear, which is hanging on a line 10 feet below me, and turn my cameras back on and turn the strobes back on, start taking pictures. And the whales stood there behind me, literally almost an hour, not quite an hour. And I went up to my 40-foot stop, I went up to my 30-foot stop, I went up to my 20-foot stop, and the whales are still coming up. And the baby whale actually came up and laid its head on my shoulder underwater while mama whale was sitting there watching. And you know why they went away? They went away when the very first diver on the vessel above me finally put a scuba tank on and dropped in the water. He took exactly 2 breaths and the whales were gone. They just left. Many, many animals do not like bubbles or the noise from bubbles. And so here's some other pictures. This is a sperm whale diving off of Dominica. And this sperm whale came up to us. We were picking bits of squid out from beneath it, between its teeth. So this is where I got my degree for being able to claim that I'm a dentist to whales. We have black sea bass, which are like large jewfish or groupers in the Caribbean. Typically, they will come in California and kind of do a buzz, a swim by to see what it is that you are when you're diving open circuit scuba. I've had them spend 45 minutes rubbing their fins against my side on a rebreather, just hanging out with me. These are the kinds of experiences that in 30 years of diving open circuit, I never had. And in 20 years of diving with rebreathers since then, I won't say that they're common because they're not, but they've occurred on multiple occasions. And to me, that's what makes diving fun. That's what makes it exciting, are these experiences that you can't predict are going to happen and are just so utterly fabulous that it's what makes it worthwhile to put on a wetsuit or put on a scuba tank or put on a rebreather and get in the water to go see what's going on. And that's what I really, really like about diving rebreathers. So here's another example. This is off of San Benedicto Island, which is part of the Socorro group. And this is a shark cleaning station in 110 feet of water. And we had 24 divers on the boat. I was the only one diving a rebreather. And in a week's worth of diving, this was the very best picture that the other 23 open circuit divers were able to get on that trip. And so you've got to remember 23 divers all hanging out, trying to get pictures of the sharks. And this was a fabulous picture by open water standards. But with a rebreather, I didn't run out of gas. So when they all ran out of gas and left and went to the surface, I stayed, sat right on the shelf where everybody else was. And 10 minutes after it left, this is what it looked like. These pictures, for those of you that are photographers, are taken with a 10.5mm lens. So to get a picture like this, with the shark looking like it's, there, that shark fin tip was nearly brushing the lens of my camera. And these sharks just swam around like I was a rock, because as far as they could tell, that's what I was. And Ryan, no fancy words about the status of my head and mental equilibrium at this point. Another advantage that you have with rebreathers are the amount of time that you can spend underwater without decompressing. So people think that rebreathers are really good for deep diving, which they are. But what they don't recognize is that when you're looking at benefits from no decompression, the biggest benefits you get are in the 60 and 70 foot range. So this slide shows a comparison between air diving with a 60-minute no decompression limit. And these were all based on the old Navy tables, just so you know. Nitrox 32, that almost doubled to 100 minutes. But setting up a rebreather, your no decompression limit was 210 minutes. So you basically have almost quadrupled your no decompression time on open circuit. 3.5 hours, that's your no decompression limit at 60 feet. And you can still see that you have lots of benefits as you go deeper, but the biggest benefits are really shallow. And in fact, we'll show you a slide later on that even shallower, you end up better. So this was a repetitive dive comparison. One dive at 60 feet for 46 minutes, a surface interval of 30 minutes, and a second dive of 32 feet. On air, I ended up as a repetitive letter group O. Now, it may be that many of you dive with computers now and you don't know what that means, but what an O letter meant on the dive tables is that you were way out on the edge and about ready to say you can't go back in the water anymore. That same dive on a rebreather ended me at a letter group B, and that is barely having been in the water. So there's a really, really big benefit for repetitive diving on a rebreather versus air diving as well. And that brings me to where we were headed before when I said that, there's some even more bigger benefits diving shallower. How many of you have been on vacation? You pay $3,000 or $5,000 to go someplace really, really fun. And when you get there, it's like, I want to go diving. And the first thing they say is, you can go diving for 6 days. But on the 7th day, just like God creating the heavens and the earth, you must rest. And you must rest because you need to off gas before you get back onto an airplane, because we don't go flying after diving. One of the really neat things about a rebreather is that you can set the rebreather up so that physiologically, your equivalent air depth is the same as being on the surface. So you don't need to memorize this equation. I've got it up there just to show you what the math is like for all of you techno nerds out there, of which I'm guilty. But here's a dive that's 30 foot. We did a set point of 1.2. On my last dive, on my last trip to Fiji, I spent 4 hours in the water, and the whole time counted as surface interval because my equivalent air depth was just under a foot. Literally, I was on the surface as far as my body was considered, looking at nitrogen that entire time. So when everybody else was sitting around their hotel room, twiddling their thumbs, trying to figure out what to do, I was diving. And that's what I love. And that's another way that rebreathers benefit recreational divers as opposed to technical divers. So the other, because you're in water and because you're running higher amounts of oxygen, you're actually flushing nitrogen out of your body faster than you would if you were just sitting on the surface. So it's not only equivalent, some places you can set up it's actually better. And the same is true for altitude diving. So you can set this up to be able to benefit yourself through altitude diving as well. Although I've got to tell you, I'd much rather do this in Grand Cayman to be able to go diving more than to be able to go diving at some high altitude lake that's 32 degrees Fahrenheit, where there's nothing to see but mud and a couple of semi-frozen trout. So I'm not trying to sell you on altitude diving. I'm trying to sell you on, let's go someplace fun and warm. So there's my fun and warm. And that's why I think rebreathers are really of a benefit to the recreational diver. You know, one of my favorite words is Tonstoffel. Tonstoffel are the first letters of the expression, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that's true with rebreathers as well. There are downsides. They're reasonably expensive to purchase. They're more expensive in some types of diving to operate. They're more complex than an open circuit scuba tank. They have additional risk factors, and it takes training to use them. So let's talk about those a little bit so you know what you're getting into. But before we do that, you have to know a little bit about the types of rebreathers that are out there. And there's three primary types: oxygen, semi-closed, and mixed gas rebreathers. Oxygen rebreathers are the rebreathers. These are the most prevalent rebreathers on the planet. And you guys are likely never, ever to see one, and certainly unlikely to use one. And the reason is that they are depth limited to 20 feet. And most of us, or at least most of my friends, want to go diving deeper than 20 feet. So who uses all of these oxygen rebreathers that are most prevalent ones on the planet? They're primarily used by spec op teams, special operations teams in the military, or they're used by firefighters fighting fires and burning buildings. You know, so there's lots of applications for rebreathers, medical rebreathers, or climbing mountains for mountaineering, but we don't typically use them much for recreational diving. So I'm going to skip over those. Semi-closed rebreathers are rebreathers that circulate some of the gas, but expel some of the gas overboard as you're breathing. These were the most common types of rebreathers in the late 1990s. This is a picture of the Draeger Dolphin on the left and a Draeger Ray on the right. There's another type of semi-closed rebreather, but what these do is they would inject a fixed amount of nitrogen into the breathing system. And because the gas was going in faster than you metabolized it, as you metabolized the oxygen and it went here, when it got to be too full, it would dump some of that gas through an overpressure valve. So these gave you a little bit more gas economy, a little bit fewer bubbles, but it didn't give you any of the advantages of decompression. They came out with semi-closed rebreathers that used a different technology, like the Hollis Explorer or the Jetsam Technology Gym. And again, they let your gas last longer. They emitted fewer exhaust bubbles, but they really didn't have all of the advantages of the closed circuit systems I'm about to show you. Closed circuit systems are really what most people think about when they talk about rebreathers today. Nearly all of the rebreathers on the market are closed circuit rebreathers, or mixed gas closed circuit rebreathers, they're more accurately called. There are two types. There are the types that are manually controlled. So this is the same rebreather design. Basically, you've got a counter lung, you breathe the gas in, you breathe it out. It goes through a chemical that removes the carbon dioxide that we breathe, and then you breathe the gas in again. This type has oxygen sensors in it that sense how much oxygen there is. And with a manual rebreather, you use a button or to be able to press to add oxygen as you need it, just like we would at the BC. Or you have a manual addition valve of like a BC button to add air, or the fancy word for that is diluent, as you need that to dilute the oxygen so it doesn't get to toxic levels. So most of the manual CCRs have a metering valve that feed some oxygen in all the time, so that if you forget to do it, it doesn't get to a point where you're so hypoxic that you pass out underwater. Most of the systems now, however, have added in another level of complexity by adding electronics here, a computer that senses and takes the readings from these oxygen sensors and then automatically uses a solenoid or an electromechanical valve to add oxygen as you need it. And then there's a series of displays so that you can see what's going on. And most of them now also incorporate dive computers into the rebreathers as well. So that you don't have to have a separate dive computer. It does all of that calculation for you. And so these are much, much easier to use in terms of the demands placed on the diver during the dive, but they're significantly more complex than the early rebreathers I used 30 years ago. And examples of these rebreathers, and these are just a few, are the Megalodon, the Liberty, the Prism 2, the Titan, the Optima is another example of those, the Revo is another example. There's about 20 different manufacturers of different electronically or manual closed circuit mixed gas rebreathers on the market right now. And one of the ones that is designed for the recreational market in particular is the Poseidon rebreather. And the Poseidon has really tried to make it so that you can't not prepare it properly. And if anything goes wrong, it forces you to go to the surface to get out of the water. And they've got fewer controls on them, so you don't have the ability to change things the way you do on some of the other mixed gas rebreathers. And so the system software is more complex, but the usability of it is less complex. The downside of that is you don't have as much flexibility by forcing it into different modes of operation based on what you're trying to do. So if you wanted to set this up to be 100%, for example, your surface interval, you wouldn't be able to do it with this type of rebreather on one of your Caribbean diving trips. People have heard that these are really a pain in the butt to maintain and prepare. And you know what? Sometimes these are really a pain in the butt to maintain and prepare. But that gets easier as you get more used to using it. A lot of it stems around using the absorbent, the carbon dioxide absorbent that we need to fill the rebreather with before we go diving. It looks like kitty litter, and you'll hear rebreather divers joke about, yeah, I have to go get my kitty litter and fill my rebreather. It's really not it's really not kitty litter. So don't go out and buy kitty litter if you're thinking about buying a rebreather. And certainly, Ryan, I know you like to save a penny here and there. Don't go out and buy used kitty litter to put in your rebreather before you go diving. The process in most rebreathers to fill a rebreather with the absorbent takes 15 to 20 minutes. And so that adds to the time that you've got to spend getting ready to dive. And so when you've got a half a dozen or a dozen rebreather divers that are all doing this at the same time, there's a lot of us that are spending a lot of time working to get the rebreathers ready just to go diving. When I teach a class and I have a rebreather student on the rebreather for the first time, typical build time for rebreather is about 4 hours. That's a long time to get ready to dive. What I will say, though, is that depending on the rebreather, if you use other technologies and some rebreathers, and you get more used to what you're doing, just like you did with open circuit diving, the build time drops significantly. And so now when I'm diving with my favorite rebreather, the build time is about 15 minutes for me. You know, if I put open circuit gear together, it's probably 5 minutes. So it's not a huge amount of extra time to be able to get ready to dive. And the advantage of that is that I set my rebreather up at the beginning of the day, and I might do 4 dives or 5 dives during the day and never change anything. I don't have to take the tank out and take my BC off, put a new tank in and put a regulator back on. I don't have to take the regulator off to put an air whip on to refill the tank, which takes 20 minutes before I go. I come up on the boat, I take the rebreather off, I go eat lunch, I have a sip of, a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, I put the rebreather back on, and I go diving again. And so it may take more time up front and at the end of the day, but the middle of the day, if you're doing multiple dives, can really be a lot more open and free. And so I can be sitting on the deck catching a suntan or reading my book or writing up my dive log while everybody else is working on changing all their gear around and waiting for the fill whip to get to be their turn. And to me, that is another advantage of being able to enjoy my vacation, because I hate futzing with gear. And so that time spent futzing with gear in the middle of the day to me is time I don't like to spend. One of the things that some rebreather manufacturers have done is they've gone to cartridges where you don't have to fill the absorbent with granular absorbent. And the advantage of this is it takes like 30 seconds to change your absorbent. You open up the lid of your rebreather, you take the old one out, you put the new one in, you put the lid back on, and you're done. And so these are the kinds of innovations that are coming out with rebreathers and rebreather technology that make rebreathers much easier to use now than they used to be. There's also a hybrid cartridge. This is the Poseidon cartridge, which uses the granular absorbent, but they've done the packing for you. All you've got to do is open up the box, take the cartridge out, and drop it in your rebreather. And there's a lot to be said for that. Additional risk factors, there's a series of other factors that we need to consider. They're more costly. I know that's risky to my bank account. It's also particularly risky when I go to my wife and tell her I want to buy another rebreather. You've got a more complex system, so there's more places for the equipment to have failures, either minor failures or major failures. You've got to worry about oxygen toxicity, hypoxia, which is not enough oxygen, caustic cocktail, which is a chemical solution caused by water dissolving into the chemical absorbent for the carbon dioxide, oxygeneer, disease transmission. These are all different issues that you learn about in training. All of them are reasonably easy to avoid, just like the major risk factors that you have with open circuit diving, which might include gas embolism, decompression sickness, getting stabbed or stung by poisonous marine animals, getting carried away by currents, getting carried by surf or surge into rocks. These are all things that we also have with rebreathers, but these can be really serious health and risk factors with scuba diving, with open circuit, that we've all accepted because we've been trained to be able to handle it. And the same thing is true with rebreathers. You go through a reputable rebreather class, and you will learn to avoid all of the risk factors that we have with rebreathers, just like you learn to avoid the risk factors that you have with open circuit scuba. Now, all that said, when I dive a rebreather, I always carry an open circuit cylinder for bailout purposes. And I typically carry an aluminum 80 because I like the way it carries. It gives me lots of gas because I can also use this to help other scuba divers that are in distress. And because for me, coming from the technical diving side, having an aluminum 80 on is about the same thing as, picking up a day pack with a couple of books in it, slinging it over my shoulder. I think nothing of it. But most people that are diving rebreathers typically carry a small pony bottle that might have 25 or 30 or 40 cubic feet of air in it. Something much, much smaller than this and much easier to carry. One of the things that I do want to make sure you're aware of, you can go oftentimes months between scuba dives and still be fine when you can put a scuba tank on. It's a little bit like riding a bicycle. Rebreathers are not so much like riding a bicycle. If you're not diving on a regular basis, and I like to tell people that a regular basis is 12 to 20 dives a year, you probably shouldn't be using a rebreather because your skills degrade to the point where you just don't remember how to respond or what to do. So rebreathers are good for recreational divers, but only if you're really an active recreational diver, not if you're somebody who goes diving once every couple of years when you're on vacation and does 2 or 3 dives. So you have to recognize when it's not the right tool for who you are as well. I will also say that with the maintenance side of rebreathers, if you don't take the time to prepare them and clean them safely at the end of the day, it's also not the right piece of equipment for you. So I'm not trying to give you the impression that rebreathers are the right gimmick or the right tool for everybody, because there's definitely people that are out there that are divers that are great on open circuit and don't have a problem. But rebreathers would not be the right tool for them to use for going underwater. Training, like anything, this requires training to be able to go out and do it. The prerequisites in most agencies are 25 open circuit dives and certification as a nitrox diver. That said, I will say that I've done training for people that are non-divers and started them on a rebreather. And I've had very good success rate with that. So this is kind of a yardstick that's used to be able to see if you're comfortable in the water, but there are other training pathways available as well. The other thing is that rebreathers in some respects are a little bit more like an airplane than we're used to. We're used to being able to get into a car, for example, and we learned how to drive my Volkswagen. And then you go to a car rental agency and they say, you want to rent a car? And they rent you a Mercedes. Well, maybe not in my case, but they'll rent me, you know, a Subaru, or they'll rent me a Ford Escort. And I don't have to, I mean, I know how to drive all those other cars because my Volkswagen is essentially the same. It's got a gas pedal, it's got a brake, it's got a gear shift, it's got a place to put in the key and turn on the ignition. And I've got mirrors in all the same places that I can, look around with. Open circuit scuba with regulators and scuba tanks, pretty much like cars. You got a regulator, it's got a first stage and a second stage and a pressure gauge. You got a scuba cylinder. The scuba cylinder has a valve on it. You put the regulator first stage on the valve and you put the scuba cylinder in your backpack or your BC. Doesn't make a difference whether there's a front mount BC, a jacket BC, a back mount BC, a set of wings. They're pretty much all the same. You got a button to put in air, you got a button to let air out, and you wear it to, you adjust your buoyancy with it. Rebreathers have not only different manners in which they operate, but they have different emergency procedures for how you bail out in an emergency. They've got different ways of monitoring the gas that is in your breathing loop. They've got different types of computers that are built into them. So when you get training in a rebreather, you get what's called a type rating, and it says that you are trained on that rebreather, that type, that model. And if you want to go learn to dive another rebreather, you want to dive a different rebreather, then you need to go through crossover training to be able to dive that other rebreather. And that crossover class, instead of being 5 days like your initial class was, it might only be a half a day or a day, depending on how similar that rebreather is to the one you trained on, but you must get training. I have right now just over, my logbook. Oh, no, my daughter just took my logbook. We went diving yesterday. She's filling in her dive log right now. I have about 2,800 hours underwater on about 25 different types of rebreathers. 2,800 hours. And with 2,800 hours of underwater time, you know what I did last August? I took a type rating class in the Liberty rebreather and took a class on how to dive another rebreather. Even myself, as a rebreather instructor, and someone who wrote, that's probably the best known textbook on the market on rebreathers, still take training programs when I go to dive a new rebreather. And so I can't stress the importance of that enough. Let me before we leave this slide, I want to remark on this slide. This is one of my very favorite training slides. And you know why? You see 8 divers in the water there in the pool, and barely a ripple on the surface. I love this slide. Every time I look at this, I think, God, if this were an open circuit class, you'd see nothing but bubbles. So it's just another sense of how different it is. So where can you learn more? Well, the first thing I'm going to say is buy a copy of Mastering Rebreathers. That's my book. Every time you buy one, I get 78 cents in my bank account. So I want to encourage all of you to go to Best Publishing, which is the company that publishes the book, and buy a copy as soon as you're off this talk. All of the major training agencies have rebreather training programs now: TDI, INTD, NALI, PADI, SSI. Many of those agencies and many local instructors will run Discover Rebreather sessions, just like we have Discover Scuba sessions where you drop into a pool with a scuba tank on without really being certified first. You can do the same thing with a rebreather and see what they're like. Or if you want, you can call me. And my phone number is there, but we're going to have a slide at the end that has my phone number on it as well. So you can start to write it down now, but I'm going to take the slide away, so you're going to lose it, but you'll have another chance. And so the point is, to me, I started in rebreathers because of my technical diving stuff, mainly because of my cave diving. But what I found was that it made recreational diving so much more fun for me and gave me so much more flexibility that I use it almost exclusively for the diving that I do. Not exclusively, but pretty close to it. I had help from a lot of people with these slides. I'd like to say all these pictures are mine, but the reality is they're not. And so those are a list of the people that all contributed photographs to this program, and I just want to say thank you. And I want to stress again, if you're a photographer, if you're a recreational diver, this is a really fun way to be able to extend your diving capabilities and experience more from the ocean than you were able to before. I love diving rebreathers. And my last slide is a barefaced, shameless plug. I'm taking a group of open circuit divers to Antarctica in December, and I still have spots for 2 more people. So if you're interested in going diving in Antarctica or going to Antarctica and just seeing Antarctica, you don't have to dive. Feel free to give me a call. The trip is, we board the vessel in Ushuaia in Southern and South America and Argentina on December 12th. You probably would figure on having to leave the States somewhere around the 8th or 9th of December, and you could get home as early as the 23rd of December, so you could still be home for Christmas. I'll be home for Christmas. At any rate, thank you all. And this is where you have an opportunity to be able to ask me questions if you would like. Ryan, that's your cue.
Working on it. Hold on.
Okay. Want to make sure I didn't lose you.
Nope, still here. All right, so we have a couple of questions. You listed a whole bunch of rebreathers. I mean, from the 7 to the Kiss to the Inspiration to the Prism.
Yeah.
What is your current go-to, or what is your favorite rebreather? If you had all of them, all 25 that you mentioned, you walked into a locker, which would you pick and why?
That's a loaded question, because what my needs are.
You're going to dive into an article with it.
Yeah, let me say that my needs are not the needs of everybody. So when I'm working a project with other rebreather divers, I like to have the same rebreather that they're using. And so if they're all diving prisms, I'll bring a prism with me and dive that, because it means the team has a really good understanding of what I'm diving, as well as me having an understanding of what they're diving. If I'm diving where I'm going around the world and I'm going to a lot of different places, I try to bring a rebreather that has a lot of inReach into the regular market. And that typically is the Inspiration or the Evolution. And I like that because everybody has parts and pieces available. You know, if something breaks, I can find Joe Diver, who happens to be an instructor for a dive shop on Utila. May not be the dive shop I'm at. I might have to drive across the island, but the likelihood is he may have a part that would help me fix my rebreather to be able to keep diving. That said, and I've got probably 15 rebreathers around the house here. The rebreather I pick up most commonly is the Titan, because it's really easy to put together. It's been really stable for me. And Lamar Hires, who owns Dive Right and makes the Dive Right rebreather, used to tell me, yeah, Jeff, my friend Jeff, I give him a piece of gear, and I've got to be really careful because Jeff could break a cannonball. That was his quote. And I have not broken a Titan. That's not true. I broke a cable one time, but the reality is, for the number of hours I've got on it, it's been really stable. The problem is that they're not made anymore. They're not currently in production. If I were to go to purchase a unit that was in production right now, I'd probably be looking at the Liberty, or maybe the Megalodon, which I'm not an instructor for, but is a nice unit, or the Inspiration, or the Optima. Those are all good units that I've got experience with. So it's probably it's probably not the answer you were looking for, Ryan, but it's a little bit of an explanation about why I picked the answer I would. And if people wanted to know, what I thought on the side, I'm more than happy to talk to people and help advise them as to what direction to move.
How do you feel, or what are your thoughts about buying and selling used rebreathers? Whether it's off Facebook, Facebook Marketplace, eBay, what have you.
About half of the rebreathers that I own, I bought used, off of Scuba Board, off of eBay, one off of Craigslist. I don't have a problem with it. I mean, they're just pieces of gear, and it's like buying a car. You can buy a car that's in good condition off of what's that group that sells cars all the time? You tell how often I buy a car.
Like car
off Craigslist, say. And some of those cars will be in great shape, and you get a great deal. And sometimes you get a car that's, not in such great shape because people didn't take care of it. So I don't have an issue with buying or selling rebreathers used, but you do need to have a better degree of understanding so that you know what it is you're buying and don't get taken. And you can find some good deals. I've bought rebreathers on the internet for, a $10,000 rebreather for $3,500. And I've got other people, I've had students actually buy them for like $1,500. But typically, if you're paying that little, there's something wrong. Again, you get what you pay for. Most of the least expensive used rebreathers I've seen in good condition, you're probably looking at about $4,000, $3,500 to $4,000. Very bare bones, and most of them you're probably looking at 5 or 6.
You mentioned you're an instructor for a few types of rebreathers. I guess the first one is, what would be required to do recreational rebreather diving? Do you recommend that people rent the equipment, or that they should purchase the equipment prior to taking a rebreather course?
That's a really good question. It's difficult to rent gear on rebreathers. There aren't many places that rent. Most instructors may provide one for training for a fee, which is kind of rental, and that would be a way of going about it. And I've done that for any number of students on different types of units. Some people find a rebreather that they fall in love with before they've even been diving on it. They buy it, they go through training, and they say, "This sucks. I don't want anything to do with this anymore." And the problem is they just got a rebreather that wasn't the right one for them. And you think, well, I'm going to buy one with all the bells and whistles, and that may not be the right unit for you. So I really would suggest spending time talking to instructors, particularly instructors that teach on more than one unit. The instructors that teach on one unit don't have oftentimes the breadth of experience that you might want to have to actually be able to give you good advice on what other units are out there. And so if I had to say, what's the best way to go, talk to instructors that teach on multiple platforms, pick their brains, maybe try diving a unit, or maybe take a class on a unit before you purchase it, and then go out and consider whether or not that's what you want to have. But you don't have to do it that way. And I've got many people that buy the rebreathers and don't come to me until after they actually own it. And it's worked out fine for them. So, it kind of goes both ways.
When it comes to the certification or training itself, do you recommend like one of the training, like the recreational training agencies, like Patty's Tech Rec, or basically more manufacturer-based training?
Doesn't make a difference. I don't think the certification agency is as important as who you get as an instructor. You want an instructor that has, just like with open water diving, you want an instructor that has a lot of time in the water, You want an instructor that has a lot of time teaching students, and preferably an instructor that has a lot of breadth of experience. And I think that you find a good instructor is probably more important than it is finding an agency, whether it's TDI or PADI or one of the manufacturing agencies.
Aside from choosing you, what else should we look for in an instructor aside from multiple units?
I would say how long they've been teaching rebreathers, how many students they've taught on rebreathers, what their how many different types of environments they go to be able to dive with rebreathers, and whether or not those environments match what you're doing. There's some really, really excellent, top-notch instructors that teach rebreathers and never dive anything but caves. And if you're looking to go diving on a reef in Cayman, that even though they're a great instructor, that may not be the right instructor for you because their experience base, where they're really talented, is not where you're going. And so you want to pick somebody that teaches and dives the kind of areas that you're going to, because they're going to be able to teach you what you want to know for the kind of diving that you do and not for the kind of diving that they do.
There's been a few questions about your books. What is the difference between the first and second editions?
Well, the first edition was written in 2000 and published in 2002 or 2004, and the second edition was done 10 years later than that, and there were a lot of changes in that period of time. So the second edition is just more comprehensive. It reflects thinking that was that had evolved since the first edition. They're both good books, but the second edition is just more recent and more up to date, and it has about 20% more content.
Do semi-closed systems make any sense anymore?
Depends on what you're doing, I suppose, like anything else. If you're looking for a low-tech solution because you're going to be diving in a place that doesn't have much in the way of support and you need more gas economy, maybe a semi-closed rebreather is a better way to go than open circuit, and where you wouldn't be able to support a mixed gas closed circuit rebreather. But the reality is, in my opinion, for probably 95% of the diving that most people do, mixed gas closed circuit rebreather is the way to go if you're going to go with rebreathers.
Are you planning on coming out with edition 3 of your book?
I am still working on volume 2 of my book, which covers technical diving. It covers cave diving, ice diving, wreck diving, mixed gas, helium-based diving for deep diving stuff. And I'm only about 50% of the way through it, and I've been working on it for 10 years because I keep getting pulled off into other projects. So before I do a third edition of my book, I want to finish volume 2 for the tech side. So I don't foresee a third edition of my book coming out within the next 5 years, shall we say.
Okay. Do you think that most rebreathers made today have too many bells and whistles, which drive up the price?
I hadn't thought about it that way. I'm going to say probably not. Most of the bells and whistles, for the most part, are things that add to safety. They increase complexity, but they provide benefits to the diver that are, for the most part, useful. Now, let me take the Liberty, for example. The Liberty has some bells and whistles on it that, for the recreational diver, don't make a lot of sense. So, for example, one of the options on the Liberty is you can get a helium sensor, so you can measure not only the oxygen, but also the helium, so that you don't have to infer what the helium content is in the gas that you're breathing. You actually measure it. But for most recreational divers, that's an unnecessary bell and, an unnecessary accoutrement. So, but automatic diluent add valves, which used to be considered accessories, are something that I think are mandatory on rebreathers now because they provide a needed safety mechanism for any diver diving a rebreather. They automatically add diluent so you don't suffocate on your way as you're going descending through the water column. I would, thinking about it, most of the bells and whistles fall into that category compared to the helium sensor on the Liberty. And the reality is that even on the Liberty, you have the option of purchasing the units without those types of bells and whistles. So again, you've got to know how it is you want to be using the tool, where you think you're going with the rebreather technology, and then base your purchase decision based on that.
This question goes back to selling used rebreathers. Hold on, lost the question. Can you see any sort of liability that would be associated with someone trying to sell a used rebreather, basically based on the training of the purchaser?
Well, let me state that this webinar is being broadcast from someplace in the United States. Is that true?
Yes.
And one of the things about the United States compared to the rest of the planet is that we are the most lawsuit happy country on the planet. Everybody gets sued for everything in this darn country. So I guess what I'm saying is, do you have to worry about the liability? I'd have to say, yeah, probably. And the more experience you've got and the more knowledge you've got, the higher the likelihood is that your liability is more significant than someone else. So let's say, Ryan, you own a rebreather and you decide you're going to move to Antarctica because you think it's really cool down there, and you leave the rebreather in your closet and you never come back to the United States. And a year from now, your girlfriend says, what's this chunk of stuff sitting in this closet? I'm going to get rid of it. And she sells it on eBay. Her liability is less than my liability would be as a rebreather instructor, were I to sell that same rebreather to the same person, because my level of knowledge in terms of what is safe in our community is different.
Got it.
And so my exposure is probably greater than the exposure of your girlfriend who knows nothing about diving.
She's certified.
Oh, well, in that case, maybe she's got some exposure. But my point is that I can't predict that because it's going to be very much circumstantial, very much based on circumstances.
Okay. What is your opinion on the solid state O2 sensors?
It's a new technology, and quite frankly, I think they're going to be wonderful. I wish that I had them in most of my units. Rich Pyle is a really good friend of mine. He's a fish researcher in Hawaii. He's been using them almost exclusively for 3 years now, and he swears by them. He says they are absolutely incredibly good. I don't have any experience with them yet, but I'm looking forward to it. So I can't give you an informed opinion, but I'm excited about
them. Are there any efforts into standardizing the user interface other than Poseidon? Any other efforts to improving the user interface?
Well, Poseidon's not any more standardized than anybody else, quite frankly. In fact, they've actually gone away from standardization in some areas in terms of looking at what other rebreather manufacturers are doing, because they're looking at a different market, a different target market. Do I think things are going to get more standardized? I wish I could say yes, but I don't see it happening anytime soon, is my guess.
As an instructor, can you ballpark how much would a rebreather course cost? Like, what should we look for basically in price range? What should it include? What should it not include?
Rebreather classes are like open circuit classes. If I go out looking for an open circuit class, I will find things being advertised, everything from free all the way to $500 or $600. And the shops that do it for free typically do it as a come on to be able to get you to buy gear, because they then tell you that you must buy your entire open circuit setup before they'll take you in training, including your tank, your regulator, your BC. And in one case out here on the West Coast, there's a shop that requires their open water students to buy a suit before they'll take them in training. So the class is free, but they end up dropping $10,000 on their equipment to take the class. There are other shops that will run a discounted class, but they have 10 people in the class. I've been teaching diving for over 40 years now. I can't teach 10 people by myself. I just can't do it and do it safely. So in a sense, you get what you pay for. My rebreather training runs a week. It's 7 days. I do 2 days in lecture, a day in building the unit and talking about maintenance, a day in the pool, and 3 days in open water. That's about twice as long as most rebreather classes. I charge $1,500. I charge more than a lot of people do. Not more than everybody, because there are people that charge more than I do. But I like to have people have a really good understanding and be comfortable by the time they finish. Open circuit training requires a minimum of 4 dives to be able to get certified. Most people are not comfortable in 4 dives. Rebreather training takes a minimum of most agencies 4 or 5 dives to get trained. Most rebreather divers are not comfortable after 4 or 5 dives. I try to get 8 or 9 open water dives in after having 4 hours of pool time in. And about dive 6 or 7, I just start seeing people really start to become comfortable. So I try to get people to the point where they're comfortable before I let them go. And if they're not, I offer them the opportunity to come back and do more training dives with my other classes. But the point is, if I were looking at a class and I'm looking for what's included, I'd be looking for lots of water time, because that's what's going to make me comfortable in the water when I go to dive it on my own. You know, think about your friends that have gone through open circuit training. They get their C card, but they get their shiny C card, and then they never dive again, because their last dive, their 4th dive, they got kicked by a wave and knocked over. Their mask got knocked off. They lost a fin, and they said, I hated that. And they never go back to it. And the same thing is going to be true. If you don't get past the point where you're past the basic skills and what you need to be comfortable in the water, you're not going to enjoy it. And so you want a class that has enough diving opportunity to be able to get to the point where you enjoy what you're doing when you won't go out on your
own. Is there any progress on CO2 sensors for CCRs on the horizon?
Well, they've got CO2 sensors on a number of units now. And the reality, you've got 2 different issues when you talk about CO2 sensors. You actually want to monitor 2 different things. You want to monitor how much of the scrubber bed of the absorbent has been used, and you want to be able to measure what the CO2 level is in the gas that you're inhaling. Those 2 things really have to go hand in hand to have an effective idea of what's going on in the system. If you just wait until you have an alarm go off because your CO2 reaches a certain threshold, in some types of diving, that's really too late to be able to do much about it. And so you really want to couple it with both of those 2 different types of technologies for you to have an effective system to be able to know what's going on with carbon dioxide in the unit. And yes, I think that that technology is going to continue to improve on both of those sides, just like I expect to see the oxygen sensor, solid state oxygen sensors continue to improve in stability and come down in cost. And so by all means, those are the kinds of things that I'm looking forward to seeing. We've got the starts of them going on now, but we have not yet achieved the level of technology that I think is going to be coming down the turnpike in the next 10 or 15 years.
Jeff, I know you've got another meeting after this. Do you have a few more minutes, or?
What time is it?
It's 8:30 our time.
Yeah, I'll go another 5 or 10 minutes if you want me to.
All right. Next question is, what can be done to minimize the caustic cocktail injury? Is one rebreather safer in this regard?
Most of the rebreathers that are current on the market, there's 2 things that have happened with that. They've designed the breathing loops on most of the systems to be able to minimize the amount of liquid that can actually travel from the scrubber canister into the inhalation mouthpiece. So most of the rebreathers that are on the market now have thought about that problem and really solved it quite well compared to the older design systems that hadn't been addressed. The other thing that's happened is that the absorbents that we're using now are significantly less caustic than the ones that used to get used in the 60s and 70s. They still can form a caustic solution. Any of the absorbents will if you leave them in contact with water long enough, but it takes longer for that to happen. and you've got other indications that things may be going wrong before you get to the point where you have a caustic cocktail. I've had one really bad caustic cocktail, but I've had lots of partial rebreather floods with caustic solution in the rebreather that haven't even impacted my dive. So that area, while it's still a potential problem, has already in many ways been reduced in terms of both severity and likelihood.
Okay. What's your opinion on side mount versus back mount rebreathers for recreational diving, and when would you choose one over the other?
I've been side mount diving on open circuit probably since the mid 1980s. So call that 35 years. And side mount diving is a really good tool for certain types of diving that I've done. Does it make sense for 90%? I mean, for most of my diving, for recreational open circuit diving, not in the least. I quite frankly don't get why people are doing it. It's trendy. It's kind of like the in thing, but the reality is I don't see it as a tool that's any better than standard open circuit back mounted cylinder for most diving and most divers, with exceptions, but for most people. Side mount rebreather diving is pretty much, I look at it the same way. I'm certified on 2 different side mount rebreather systems. They are certainly the right tool for certain circumstances, but for my standard open water diving, you know, I went diving today. I went down to the beach and went diving. I wouldn't pick up a side mount system and take it down to the beach to go diving with me. It's not comfortable to carry, and it's not the right system for it. So my personal preference is to shy away from side mounts because it's just, for most of the diving that I do, it's not the right tool. So that's my thought on it.
Okay. Got a question versus manual. Hold on. Ooh, where'd it go? This is a clarification. Does a basic manual CCR bleed O2 into the loop at a low rate without manual input, while an eCCR driven manually requires constant attending?
Yes and no. Most of the manually operated rebreathers do have a constant bleed of oxygen into the system, but you still need to monitor what's going on, and you have a higher degree of attention that's required, because as your metabolic rate changes, which is really what happens when you exercise more, that bleed does not change. And so you've got to be more cognizant of what it is you're doing to be able to add the additional oxygen that you need when you're under a great deal of stress metabolically. That usually happens at the same time that you are less focused on running the rebreather, because something else is going on. You're fighting to get out of a current, you're fighting a big fish that you just shot, or in my case, I'm trying to get that chest of gold doubloons that I just found off of the Florida Keys up to the surface. And I'm not thinking about the rebreather, I'm thinking about the golden doubloons in that chest of gold that I've got. So my personal opinion is that when manual rebreathers need the most attention is when you have the least amount of bandwidth available for it. The electronically controlled rebreathers will compensate for that automatically because they're monitoring the oxygen for you. But if there's a problem with the way they're functioning, you have to be monitoring it to make sure that they continue to do their job properly throughout the dive. So I train all of my divers to fly their units manually because they build the skill set to be able to monitor at a proper sequence there. But the electronics provide a safety net, as it were, that you wouldn't necessarily have on a manual system. So I prefer eCCRs, but I've used both.
Why would a manual make any sense if you are still relying on an electronic sensor?
Because that's all that you're relying on are the sensors. So you don't have to worry about computers, you don't have to worry about electronics. It's basically an analog digital switch that just takes the values of the voltage from the sensors, turns it into a number, and displays the number on an LCD. It gets rid of all the other complex electronics. It gets rid of the electromechanical valve, the solenoid. It gets rid of a lot of the cabling and the wires. So it reduces the system complexity and the chances for failures on the electronic side. And if you looked at those kinds of failures on the early rebreathers, there were a lot of them. It's less common now because they've been able to engineer or design those in a much more stable manner, but they still are a simpler system with fewer moving parts. And so it's a compromise system. It comes down to philosophy. What types of risk do I want to accept based on what kinds of risk do I want to avoid? And there's no right answer for that for everybody. My answer is not necessarily the right answer for you, nor the right answer for Corey, nor the right answer for whoever it is that's listening to us right now.
All right. Last couple questions. What are your thoughts on pre-packing the cans or sealing them in Ziploc bags? And what are your thoughts on stopping the usage on the can and resuming?
So the first question is, if you've got dry absorbent and you are filling your canister and then sealing it again, I don't have a problem with that because it's brand new absorbent. There's nothing happening. It's still isolated. It's no different than having it in the bucket, unless you're traveling with it. And if you're traveling with it and you're going over, it's being subjected to a fair amount of mechanical agitation, you can get additional settling in the canister that if you don't open it up and recheck it when you get to your destination, may leave you with a gap or a void that allows channeling to take place. Channeling being the gas going through the absorbent bed or bypassing the absorbent bed, and you don't know that it's happening. And in fact, my wife passed out on a rebreather dive because of CO2 buildup from exactly that issue. The canister was packed in Panama City. It was driven to California. We went diving in California without checking it. It had settled about 3/4 of an inch. We didn't realize it, and there was this huge void where the gas wasn't going through the scrubber at all. It was just bypassing it. But if you're not doing that, then that's not an issue. In terms of using a canister partially and then stopping and then picking it up and using it again in the future, we don't have any good data on that. There's a fair amount of operational data that seems to indicate that people have done it with impunity, myself included. But if I had to tell you it was safe or unsafe or what the level of risk is, I can't really say one way or another because I've got no measurement on it. And as a scientist, I'm unwilling to say that what I've done and the way I've done it is, I mean, I can't measure what the real risk is. So I don't know how to answer that question in an objective manner.
Last question. It's got multiple parts.
Uh-oh. It's just like a multiple guess question. If I get one part wrong, am I going to fail my exam because all the other 8 questions behind it are going to be wrong?
Yes, it's a yes or no question.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to go any further then.
When buying a used unit, what are the most important things to look for? Do most units have 3 O2 sensors? And if something was to fail, what would it be? And if it fails, or what could fail where it's not worth repairing and it's worth scrapping the unit?
That's a lot of questions.
Okay.
First thing I'd look for overall general condition of the unit. Does it look like it was taken care of? Just like when you go to buy a car, does the paint look nice when you open it up? Is the engine clean? When you look at the tires, are the tires full? Do they appear to be uncracked? When you look at the seats, do the seats appear to be in good shape, or the leather ripped and the upholstery torn and the header on the roof, got stuffing coming out? A car that physically looks bad is probably not in very good shape mechanically either. And I'll say the same thing is probably true for a rebreather. What would I look for? I would want to assemble it and make sure that everything seems to go together well and that it appears to be functioning on the surface. And quite frankly, given a choice, I'd try to dive it. Now, do I want to recommend that somebody that has a low amount of experience dive a used rebreather before they really are comfortable diving it? I'm not sure I want to go that far out on a limb and make that as a suggestion, because it really is going to be based on experience. But by diving the unit, I've got enough experience to be able to say, yeah, this is functioning the way it's supposed to. This feels the way it's supposed to feel. it's breathing the way it's supposed to feel, because I've got enough breadth of experience to be able to say it feels okay. Just like if you go to drive a car and you're driving a used car and you hit the brakes and the car doesn't slow down very much, you might think to yourself, this doesn't feel like every other car I've driven. When I hit the brakes in other cars, typically the car stops. So it takes some amount of experience with used cars to be able to buy a used car with some degree of confidence. And the same is true with rebreathers as well. What other things would I look for? The state of the O-rings, are they cracked? Are they dry? The state of the mushroom valves, what do they look like in the mouthpiece? The state of the hoses and what they look like. Whether the regulators are functioning or whether they're sticking, whether the BC on them is sticking. So all of those are things that I would be evaluating if I were looking to purchase a used rebreather. What was the last part of the question, Ryan?
If part of a rebreather was to fail, say the electronics, when does it sort of become a write-off rather than repair?
Depends on the rebreather. On the Titan, if you can't get the electronics are dead, you just can't get new electronics. You're done. It's unlikely that that's the part that's failed, but I'm just saying if that were the case, I'd be done on that. I've had cracked housings and inspirations where the housing was cracked and the frame was cracked on the part that carries on your back as well. At that point in time, it becomes cost prohibitive to be able to replace those. You're probably better off to have bought a new unit to begin with, because by the time you buy the used unit and start putting parts into it, you've spent enough money that it wouldn't have been a big jump to buy a new unit to start with, or to buy a used unit that was maybe twice as expensive, but in much better shape. But there's no single part that I would say on any given rebreather that I could state with the certainty that if this has failed, don't look at it, because it's going to vary from unit to unit.
Any preference on counterlung location?
I've gotten to the point where I prefer back mount because I like having my front uncluttered, because it allows me to take pictures and allows me to work with students and allows me to work on science stuff without having stuff in the way. Not to say that front mounted units are bad. I've used both, but I prefer back mount.
Any noticeable breathing resistance?
Depending on the unit, yes. But Ryan, I'm gonna have to beg off. I now really need to get to my other presentation.
No problem. Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you all for joining me, and hopefully we'll bump noses, preferably underwater someplace. All be safe.